This is Austin Liti Limits, where authors talk to authors about books and the craft of storytelling. Sponsored by Blue Ink Review, because typing the end is just the beginning. Find out more at blueinkreview.com. Best-selling author Deanna Roy joins us for this edition of Austin Liti Limits. She writes under several pen names, including J.J. Knight, and has had success in both the independent and traditional publishing worlds. And here's our colleague Ron Siebold.
Deanna has published more than 60 books under 4 pen names, including her own. She's written children's books and romance novels. She's also written nonfiction books about loss and grief. I reached out for an interview about her journey from unknown to USA Today bestseller. She tells us about her steps to success in publishing her own novels right alongside her novels from a traditional publisher. In the first of 2 parts, here's a remarkable story. The thing I'm most curious about to begin with is, how do you write 65 books, or more importantly, how do you write them so quickly?
Well, I didn't start writing books quickly. I started writing, a book in 2 years, I think, like most of us. And then you learn, right? The second one goes a little more quickly because you're like, I can finish one. So now you have that confidence, and then you sort of write more swiftly. And then I think early in your career, you have so many ideas, you want to get it all down. And then later you start realizing, oh, okay, there's certain things that are marketable and there are certain things that are books of your heart. And so once you take away the book of your heart out of it, and go for like, okay, this is my career now, this is my livelihood, it becomes more where you meld your personality with the book, but you may not be melding such an emotional attachment to the book that it slows you down. I find when I write the books of my heart, it takes a very long time. The most recent one I released was This Kiss. I released it last year. I started writing that book in 2017. And even as an indie, I didn't release it till 2023. So that tells you how long it can still take me to do a book if it's that level of connection to me. Whereas my romances, which I write, and I love them just as much, but I write more for the paycheck, for the fandom, for just everything I love about being an author, I usually knock those out in about 10 weeks.
Wow. So when you're working 10 weeks worth, it's like 5 days a week for you or more?
Yeah, I work Monday through Friday. I write about 10,000 words a week for 10 weeks. The first couple weeks, I allow myself to write a little less because I'm often rewriting. I'll write chapter 1 about 6 times still, even 65 books in. I will write chapter 1 about 6 times. Every once in a while, I knock it out of the park on the first try, but that is so rare. Usually by about chapter 5, I go, oh, okay, wait. This character is turning out to be a little different than I thought, so I have to go back and adjust her voice. And that's just as true for the book I'm writing right now as it was way back in, 2006 is when I wrote my first adult novel. It was, that's the same age-old issue. If you're a pantser, now, of course, there's all kinds of writers. I considered myself a plotter early on because I would do detailed outlines. And then I considered myself a pantser because when I started writing quickly, I kind of didn't use outlines. But now I realize I'm something in between. So I have an initial idea for the story. I will write about 20,000 words with no outline, no thought. I just blare through it. And that's the moment in which I assess, okay, what am I doing with this story? And then I use my plot device help, like, okay, I'm here at this, first coming to the end of the first act of the 3-act structure. If that's the thing I see emerging, it could be that I'm seeing what's actually emerging as a hero's journey. So I'll go, okay, now we're doing the failure to take the call moment here. So I kind of see where I'm hooking in to existing models of what is a story that resonates. And I can use that to help me if I need it. I don't always. This particular book, just this last few days, I went back and said, okay, I'm stuck. I need to figure out what should happen next. And then as soon as I caught up to where the book should be, I was like, okay, I got it. And I moved right on. And that's how I can write a book in 10 weeks. I don't get stuck for more than a few hours.
Do you work with a Bible for a series?
I don't have a Bible per se. I've tried doing them. Um, but to do that actually caused me to stop. Actually, when I had a full-time assistant for about 4 years, and she kept a Bible for me for some of my early series. But right now I work in Scrivener, and
Yes. Oh, it's so
isn't it
good.
wonderful? So what I do now is every series basically has a template. So I finish, for example, I finished Royal Pickle, right? And in the resources, I have characters, I have images of the characters, how old they are, when they were born, their backstories, their parents, their families, where they live. And then when I do book 2 of the series, I just save as, delete the
Yeah.
book out, and leave those resources in there. So it becomes a Bible sort of naturally. I don't have
Yeah.
to do any extra work. I don't have to pay anybody to go through and find all the character names. I had to do this though. Um, I did have to create not a Bible for my series, but I had to create like a Deanna Bible at some point because I made
Mm.
a very terrible mistake. And I realized after I published a middle grade book for 8 to 12-year-olds, I had this wonderful, sweet character named Jax. And I'd kind of forgotten. I'd written that book early in my career and hadn't published it because I was trying to get a traditional publisher back then and didn't. But then my husband and I wrote an entire romantic suspense series. And it wasn't until years later, and this series was steamy, steamy, steamy. Like the highest steam stuff that I've done was that pen name. I went back to pick up that middle grade book, and we were going to publish it through a middle grade press. And I realized that I'd used the name Jax for a cute little 12-year-old boy in a kid's book and for the steamiest book I'd ever written in my life. And that's when I realized I needed a Deanna Bible because there were names that I kept gravitating toward. And when
Yeah.
I created the Deanna Bible, I realized I had reused many names across different series. And that was the only super inappropriate reuse of a name. But I wanted to make sure I was a little bit more even-handed with the use of the names. So I did intentionally set down like a Deanna author Bible where I look at the places where I set my books. I look at the story tropes that I'm using, the story lines, the types of characters, just to make sure that I'm not repeating myself too often with very, 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 very similar books, names, or tropes.
Yeah. Tropes, you find them useful?
Oh, they're the best. In romance right now, tropes are king. I mean, about 2 years ago, we started seeing the emergence of these little graphics, and you put your cover in the middle, and then you have these little squiggly arrows, and then you put all your tropes that are in your book around it. And readers look for those things because they want certain stuff or they want to avoid certain stuff. There's like a whole contingent who doesn't want a surprise baby. They don't want to read about a surprise baby, so they're going to look for that surprise baby and go, nope, off my list. Or if they're
Wow.
seeking friends to lovers, they're going to look on those graphics and seek the friends to lovers trope.
What's your definition of the difference between a romance and a love story? I've read a few, but I'm curious what you think.
Well, I feel like that's pretty set in stone, honestly. We had a big
Yep.
conversation about that in the romance room at the Writers League conference, but a love story can end tragically. So Nicholas Sparks, Romeo and Juliet, those are examples of love stories. But a romance, what you're seeking when you read a romance is that happily ever after, that happy feeling at the end. If there isn't a happy feeling at the end, it's still a beautiful, wonderful love story, but it's not what the romance readers are looking for. So it is technically not a romance. You can even get it a little more fine-tuned by saying there's a love story and then there's romantic elements and then there's a love interest. Those are all things that can happen. But a true romance is generally whatever's happening, even if it's shoot 'em up in the background or it's paranormal in the background, it's about the change the characters make to come together. Whereas otherwise it's romantic elements. You just have two people getting together in the midst of the gunfire, as opposed to there being gunfire in the background of their love story.
Right. So what led you to romance?
I loved it since I was young. That was the genre I read the most. Once I got out of my sci-fi stage as an early teen, I switched to romance and I never went back. I had written about 1,000 romance novel reviews by the time I became an author. I had a website in '98 for those people who are around. There was we all were creating websites on what was called, oh gosh, what was it? GeoCities. And I had a
Yes.
romance review site on GeoCities in Soho
Wow.
Square, right? And
Yeah.
I had several hundred of them up there. I love Lavril Spencer and Kathleen Woodwis, and there was just Susan Elizabeth Phillips. I was just writing reviews of all those, mainly so I could keep track of the books that I loved. It never occurred to me to write a romance then. When I went to college, I took literature classes, and then I started taking short story classes and other writing classes. It was all very literature driven. So when I started writing my own works, they were all very literature driven. There was nothing at the writing accessibility level that romance is. You can't you can't very quickly blow through Pride and Prejudice, right? Or any of these. So you have to. It's meant for you to slow down and take it in. But romances aren't always that way. A lot of times we're reading a romance to get to the feelings. So what you have to learn when you're writing those is that it's a different sentence structure, a different paragraph structure, the length of chapters are different. But I already intrinsically sort of had knew that because I'd read so many. When I started writing, I was writing literature style, and I had self-published about 12 books. I hadn't been able to find an agent. I'd been looking for like 20 years to get an agent, and I hadn't succeeded. But when self-publishing came about, I published my first ones. They were very literature heavy, and they did okay, but not enough. But the bug, I was bitten by that self-publishing bug, and I wanted to write full time. So my friend said, "Well, you're going to have to learn to write romance." And so a couple of them sat me down and said, "Your sentences are too long. Nobody can skim. They can't skim to what they're looking for. They might be skimming to get to a love scene. They might be skimming to get to an emotional scene. They might be skimming to get to the trope they're looking for, but they're not able to skim your books because they're too dense." I'm like, okay. So I sat down with the Flesh Kincaid, writing, and where it tells you what grade level you're writing at. And I learned how to write at a level where you could skim the book for what you were looking for and still tell us that satisfying story on many levels. So those readers would all, and then that was when I had my first really big hit book. My first USA Today bestseller was written completely with that in mind. It's still, if you read it, it's forever innocent. If you read it now, you'll still see that literature sort of I don't know, color in it. But
Yeah.
what I did, and maybe this was the stroke of genius, maybe I got lucky, is I made my main character a literature student. So whenever she did get verbose or literary, her mechanic boyfriend would be like, "There's that girl in you again," and so it made sense for the story.
I love it. Talk to me a little bit about your self-publishing choice. You said you started early. When was your first self-published book?
I mean, technically it's 2009.
Wow.
And that's before we really were doing Kindle. I did not do an ebook of that book. So what was happening back then is I had a website that had 1 million visitors a month, and it was on the topic of pregnancy loss.
Right, right, because that's another one of your
Main topics.
subgenres, if you
Mhm.
will.
Right. So I started it so early. I started that website in '98 on GeoCities. And as soon as we could buy our own domains, I bought my own domain. So I was in the very first wave of having a domain of my own. And because of that, for years and years and years, I mean, years, whether you went to Excite or Yahoo and eventually to Google, I was like in the top 5. If you typed in miscarriage or pregnancy loss, I was up there.
How
So
about
I
that?
had a huge forum, just a huge community of women. So when I created my first book about on the subject, thought it was a sure thing that a publisher would pick it up, and they didn't. And it was super frustrating. I tried multiple ways to get published surrounding this platform I felt that I had, and none of them sold. So eventually in 2009, I really, really wanted to get one project out. It didn't exist at the time, and it was a baby book for babies that are miscarried or stillborn. Because
Hmm.
most baby books that exist in the world go on to First Step and First Smile, and that's the majority of the book. And I wanted one that kind of went just to the end of the pregnancy, the hospital, and then had a memorial section.
Yeah.
I was desperate to get this sucker published. I just I mean, I went everywhere. I hit every door of every gift book publisher, and nobody would take it. And looking back on it, I get why, because they're looking at a 6 week to 3 month cycle in a bookstore, whereas I'm looking something that needs to just always be there. And they
Right.
just wouldn't put me at the level of what to expect when you're expecting. And I didn't want my book to be in the pregnancy section anyway. That's not
Yes.
something you want to come across as you're
Right.
looking at those other books. And you don't want to be near the pregnancy books when you're looking for this book either. So I was very sensitive to that. So I realized, well, the website's the best place to sell this thing. So I went ahead and called around at IBPA. It was one of the small, at the time it was really for like small indie publishers that were just very small houses, right? Super tiny houses. And they had a list of places where you could get your books printed. And I did quotes all over the US, which were crazy high. The book was going
Hmm.
to cost like $11 or $12 a piece to
Whoa.
print. It was full color. It was, there was a lot of things about that made it expensive. But then I was able to get some brokerages for printers overseas, and they were able to get the print cost down to $3 or $4. As long as I ordered in big giant bulk. I had to order a minimum of 5,000. Yeah. So I was a single mom at that time with two little kids, and I couldn't swing that. But I
No.
had set up the LLC, I had set up the company to publish it, and now I had no books to publish because I couldn't afford to do that. And there was a book by Aaron Shepard. It was like the first of its kind, and it said, "Here's how you can self-publish your paperback." And it gave you the steps, and we used uh, the precursor to Ingram Spark, which is what we all use, which is Lightning Source.
It, they still use that
You
name when
still
they're
use
doing it.
that. They don't, they prefer small self-publishers not use Lightning Source. They want to use Ingram Spark, but I still have a Lightning Source account. I have both.
Yeah.
So I went to Lightning Source and I said, okay, I have an account now, but I couldn't publish the book I wanted. So I needed something to publish. And so the very first book I published in 2009 was a book with my daughters. And it was how kids show kids how to make balloon animals. And it was a children's book, a full color children's book. They had gone to Magic Camp and learned how to tie balloons. And while they were gone off with their dad, I got on Amazon to buy them more books on how to tie balloons now the camp was over, and there were none. The only things that existed were a few for professional uh, balloon artists. And I'm
Yeah.
like, my 7 and 10-year-olds can't use this book. And that was just when it all ding, ding, dinged for me. And I said, I was a photographer at the time. I'm like,
There
I
you
could
go. I was
make
going to
this
ask you about
book.
that.
I could make this book. I had been a photographer for, I see, at that point, I guess about 10 years. And I had a studio. So when the girls came back, I bought them little black turtlenecks and we got them the most colorful balloons we could buy. And I just photographed them doing the balloon twists. And we created, I guess it was like a 24-page book, how to make balloon animals. And I uploaded it through Lightning Source. Um, and it was the wildest thing ever. I mean, it became an instant bestseller.
Yeah.
And I think I'm like looking at my numbers. I've got them here. How much has it made to this day, Balloon? It's made about $20,000 to this day, that book. So,
Wow.
and every year, even now, that book is old, old, old. It still will make about $1,000 every Christmas, and usually at the beginning of summer, it'll make about $1,000. So it's still going strong, uh, seasonally.
Did you sell that through your website or Amazon?
I did it strictly through distribution with Lightning Source. So it was in Barnes and Noble and it was in the Amazon. But we did a lot of really, because I had these two girls who could twist balloons. So when our school had their Scholastic Book Fair, I went to our librarian and said, "Hey, would you like the girls to twist balloons if you'd let us sell our book alongside the Scholastic Book Fair?" And she said, "Sure, why not?"
Yeah.
So we got to do that. And once we had pictures showing we did that, we got into Barnes and Noble and we were able to do a signing, and that was big. There were
Wow.
probably 50 kids there because having kids present their book and then we actually made balloons with the kids, that was big. And then several Barnes and Noble stocked our book, and then a bunch of libraries stocked our book. And I think that was when we really started seeing some movement that has, I mean, still today, still get sales for those books. But what
When
that
you
book did for me, it gave me the money to do that print run in China.
whoa, how about that? On the backs of balloons. I
Yeah.
guess when you were selling those books into the libraries, you needed a library binding then, right?
I didn't. I didn't. I mean,
How about that?
I didn't know how to do that. And one thing, I volunteered at our school library, and one thing I knew is if a book came through that was not as well bound as the others, they had ways to handle it. They had these
Okay.
little plastic things and these little tape that went on them, and they reinforced them.
Yeah.
So it was fine. It was fine. If they wanted the
Yeah.
book, they were going to find a way to put it in their library, because I had no way of doing it. In fact, to this day, I have not done a hardcover of that book because it won't lie flat. And that's
Got it.
frustrating for the little kids to try to leave it open. And our big thing was trying not to frustrate the kids.
Yeah.
So in the paperback, you can push flat and it'll stay flat.
So one of the things I have here as a note is investment. So I'm wondering about hiring people to help with things that you didn't know. Did you bring somebody on in your team at some point that you're like, okay, you're on layout and everything that has to do with printer interface, I'm going to rely on you. Was there somebody like that?
Absolutely. When I published my first novel in 2011, which was Baby Dust, which again was a miscarriage, kind of women's fiction on the literary side story, I did not know how to format a book. I did not know how to do a cover properly. I did not know, how to lay out a paperback. I didn't know how to do any of that at all. So I did hire someone to do all of that for me. To date, that is the most expensive book I've ever produced because, at that time, what we were doing was pretty unusual. And so we were hiring people who were used to working for traditional publishers and getting paid pretty large sums. So I paid a couple $1,000s for a cover. I paid, I think, $1,000 for the internal layout of a novel. I mean, now I can churn out the internal layout of a novel in like 90 seconds using Vellum. But
Right.
those tools weren't available back then. So yes, I was
Wow.
definitely hiring out a lot of that stuff. Now the ebooks, there was kind of no one to hire. It was the Wild West at that point. So I learned how to do that. I had a little bit of a leg up because I've been doing websites since GeoCities, and really an ebook is nothing if it's not really code, much
Built
like
from the same thing. It's all
yes.
HTML.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. So we were using a couple cobbled together free things. It was just crazy. The stuff we were,
Caliber.
yes, we were using Caliber. There was another one we used to convert. Caliber was the one we used to convert, but there was another one that I would use if I got stuck because I could see the coding more easily. I don't even remember the name of it anymore. And at the time, I published a little book on how to publish an ebook. It's no longer available because obviously it got outdated within a year.
Yeah.
But if you were discerning and did a deep search, you could probably find a book that I wrote early on how to self-publish a book. And I hadn't been successful at it yet, other
Yeah.
than this balloon book, which was really a paperback. But I did know how to do it. And boy, it sure was hard to learn back then how to do it.
So all of this gives you opportunities to exert control over the process. And if you're a
Oh, yeah.
professional, lots
For
of
better or for
professionals.
worse.
Yes. If it's a mistake, you know who to point the finger at, right?
Yeah, yeah. If I have a cover that flops, it's my fault, right? Even if I
Yeah.
hired somebody, because I have found even 65 books in, I have hired very expensive, top-notch, king of the hill cover designers and still have that series flop. It's not really a sure thing just because you hire somebody at the top of the chain. You still have to know a little bit about what's normal for your subgenre, where you're going to sit in the store with other books, what are your comp titles, what is Amazon going to recommend after you, and then who are they gonna recommend to you? That all plays into the thing, and the book designers are really good at what they do, but they don't know as intimately as you do how your book is going to fit in the Amazon ecosystem.
I found my cover designer off of Reedsy. Where'd you dig yours up at first?
I will see in the early days, I think this has always been true. It's always been word of mouth. I don't ever hire sight unseen anybody anywhere. If 2 or 3 people will agree that they had a good experience with them, I'll do it. I hired a couple here and there that were so highly touted because you would look inside the books of best-selling books and see who their cover designer was. I did that twice. And
Mm,
the first time, I think it took me 6 months to finally get all my covers out of her. It was awful. It was the worst experience. She just definitely seemed to have favorites, and everybody else kind of didn't get. And you don't know that unless you talk to people at your level who've worked with
right.
them. If you talk to, Lucy Score, maybe, the top level author, they're maybe getting treatment that they don't even realize they're getting. It's possible.
Yes.
So
Yes. Good point.
I learned that I was not going to get the good treatment at that point. Possibly now, I do get deferential treatment. It's hard to say, but yeah, 2 or 3 people have to agree that they are consistent, they're on time, they're easy to work with, or I can't work with them.
Yeah. Well, okay. I'll let you go for now, and we'll be back in touch.
All right. Hi, Ron. Thank you.
This has been a presentation of Austin Liti Limits, made possible with help from our good friends at Blue Ink Review, where typing "the end" is just the beginning. Find out more at blueinkreview.com.